Welcome, everyone. This is the April OpenNTF webinar, April 2024, and our presenter today is Jesse Gallagher from the OpenNTF board and one of the primary contributors to OpenNTF. Jesse's going to be talking about the switch from Java 8 to 17 that's now available in Domino 14. And let me click. There we go. So we'll do some quick welcome slides and then the presentation, and then we'll have Q&A afterwards. Quick thank you to our sponsors, primarily HCL and Prominic. They make contributions here to allow the community to function and thrive and allow us to support the community, and we very much appreciate their contributions. Quick note about the community. Of course, if you're on this webinar, you are part of OpenNTF, and we would like to encourage you to share what you know. Help people learn from each other. I know certainly I've been in the community for a good long time, but I still learn from other people regularly. And I know good friend of the community, David Leedy of Notes in 9 fame, was always fond of saying that even if you say something that somebody else has said, by you saying it in a different way might help somebody understand that thing in a way that they weren't able to before. So please don't feel like all topics have been covered, because we can all continually learn from each other. So please do jump on to the Discord server and help us out, share what you know, and learn from each other. Quick note about upcoming events. We have Engage as a community event next week in Europe, in Belgium, specifically in Antwerp. And there's going to be a good number of people from OpenNTF there, so we hope to see you. I will be attending. Actually getting on a plane later tonight. And at Engage, we will be having a live Hangout Repair Cafe that will be towards the end of the day on Wednesday. We're up against several other really good sessions. In fact, a couple that I'd like to go and see. So, but we'll be splitting up and making sure that there's opportunities for people to come and share what they know. We'll also be hosting that on the Discord channel. It's a couple of hours earlier than our normal time, and a couple of topics we'd be interested in hearing people talk about is sharing your modernization story in the Domino world, or maybe if people are checking out ChatGPT or anything to do with AI and how that might work in the Domino world. Those are a couple of topics that we want to have some fun talking about. And then our regular normal monthly Repair Cafe Hangout is happening as always on the third Thursday, 11 a.m. for people in the Americas and 5 p.m. for people in Central Europe, or adjust your time zone accordingly. And all of those events listed there are available on the events page in Discord, and I'm going to share the link to join the Discord community if you haven't already in a second. Just some other Engage presentations. These are people who are on the OpenNTF board and what they're going to be talking about. Paul Withers has got a cast of people who are involved in open source with the variety of HCL products. So we're going to have just kind of a roundtable of people talking about the different open source tools and information that's available for all of the different HCL products. Heiko has been playing around with ChatGPT, so he's got a session. Sidar has been also playing with large language models and have the session, so we've got a couple of different AI sessions there. The deep dive into debugging in Domino with Kim and Michelle, they did this as an OpenNTF webinar a couple of months ago. They're doing a live session in Antwerp. And Paul Withers and Devin Olson are giving an overview of VoltScript, the new stuff that they've been working on to help with integration with VoltMX. And Paul and Stefan Wissel are also talking about web apps without frameworks, another interesting kind of pushing the boundaries of new technology topic that's going to be at Engage. So those are a bunch of sessions that folks involved with OpenNTF are going to be part of when we're there. A couple of other quick comments. I didn't get them into the slides, but Sutal in the Czech Republic is going to have a user group meeting in May, and DNUG has ongoing meetings, one of which is coming up in June. So we've got lots of education happening around the world as we move into spring and summer here. This is the link to the Discord channel. We were just part of a meeting where we were talking about the Domino REST APIs and how folks from HCL use the OpenNTF Discord channel for the Domino REST APIs as their primary place to go to get feedback from the community. So just a highlight of the fact that folks from HCL are very active on the OpenNTF Discord server and are coming here to get feedback from the community. So it's the right place to be, the right place to go to be able to interact with folks from HCL. Coming up in May, Paul is going to reprise the VoltScript presentation as our next webinar. In June, we're going to get into the DKIM and SPF enhancements that have gone into the Domino server. And also in June, we're going to host our OpenNTF annual general meeting. Just a note on timing there, we need to publish the dates, but typically we've used our June webinar slot for the annual general meeting, but Roberto's been doing a lot of work to get a good lineup of speakers, so we've got more speakers than we have time slots, so we're going to move the OpenNTF annual general meeting to a different time slot, so keep your eyes open for when that's going to happen. All right, right before we get into the presentation, a reminder about asking questions. We like to keep the questions to the end of the presentation. By all means, ask them as the presentation is going along, but we like to keep them to the end so that we can get them into the YouTube video and have them asked and answered so people can hear them. And of course, if we have too many questions and not enough time, we'll create a blog post and put it onto the YouTube page. And we all had a chuckle last time. Yes, this presentation is being recorded. Somebody in the middle of the last one, and it usually happens at least for 50% of the presentation, somebody asks invariably during the middle of the presentation if it's being recorded. Yes, it is. Yes, it's going to be on YouTube. Just go to the webinars page. And just a reminder too, we want to keep our questions focused on the topic at hand. Again, if there's something you want to ask that's not to do with this webinar, by all means, jump over to Discord. We're watching. That's the place to talk about it. And with that, I will hand it over to Jesse.
All right. Hello and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about the differences in the new stuff, the fun stuff in Java 8 and Java 17, some less fun stuff, but mostly the fun stuff. If you're not familiar with me, my name is Jesse Gallagher. I'm the CTO of I Know Some Guys, which is a consulting company outside of Philadelphia in the United States. I'm also the IP manager at OpenNTF, and I'm on the board there. I blog fairly regularly at frostilic.us, and I am on Mastodon, or your ActivityPub compatible service of choice, at jesse@pub.frostilic.us. So before I get into the meat of this, I generally have a prerequisite slide just to let you know, like, okay, is this even going to be of interest? In general, if you don't care about Java, this will probably not be of particular interest to you. But beyond that, if you do, it helps if you know about optional and other things in Java 8, because I don't go into like too heavy detail on this, but that is good to know. You don't need to know anything about OSGI. You don't need to know anything about XPages. If you've only ever done Java agents, that's totally fine, because all of this applies. I'm not going to talk about anything to do with XPages specifically at all, or OSGI. I mentioned OSGI, but that's about it. So getting into kind of what's been going on with Java recently. So in the old days, things came at a pretty steady pace. Java 1 through 6, somewhere in the, for Java 5, they kind of changed the version numbers, although internally it was different. Things went along at a pretty good clip. You see 96, 97, 98, and then it's like, okay, well, 2 years, and then takes a little longer. 6 to 7 takes 5 years for some reason. And as you probably recall, if you've been doing Java on Domino, Domino took even longer and was stuck at Java 6 basically until it was completely untenable to do so, until 901, FP8, and 10. And then finally we get Java 8. So, admittedly, the whole industry was in a bit of a slog, and by the whole industry, I mean Oracle, or I forget when Oracle bought Sun, but around then things were a little dire. But things kind of picked back up, and then things started to get nuts. So starting with Java 9, there's a whole new system. There's a new release of Java every 6 months, on the dot. It just happens constantly. And some of these are considered LTS. So LTS meaning long-term service. This is similar to like Ubuntu or other sort of rapid release cadence products. The original plan was every 6 releases, now 4. Unfortunately, this version system sucks because there's no way to tell just looking at the number, is this an LTS? So like the LTSs after 8 are 11, 17, and 21. Good luck understanding why those are the ones. Like, why did they go, 3, then 6, then 4, and then, in theory they're doing every 4, but you just kind of have to know. I really wish they hadn't done it like this, but they did. And here we are. So you just kind of have to know which ones are the magic numbers. Hopefully it will remain 4 for a while. So Domino did not get Java 11. Domino did get Java 17 in Domino 14, which at the time was the current LTS version. Just after Domino came out, Java 21 became the LTS version. I have some stuff at the end, but Java 17 is new enough for us, honestly, and pretty much that's where everything is landing as the new kind of the standard version of Java, at least for a little while longer. Libraries and application frameworks and things tend to intentionally lag a little bit because you can't expect everybody to update immediately, much as we might want them to. So there's also the concept of Java distribution. So if you are just going into this clean, you might think, well, I'll go download Java. And so if you do that, you'll probably get to like java.sun.com or something and download that one. Oracle maintains the normal Java, but its licensing terms have gotten more restrictive. So it used to be that I think you could just use it willy-nilly for commercial purposes. And then now they're like, yeah, sure, except you have to pay us $1 million at the very least. But Java is open source in its own weird way. So the Eclipse Foundation maintains Adoptium, and names get weird because I think they're all islands, which fair enough, but it's hard to remember. Their version is called Tamarin, fully free and open source. So this is kind of the go-to, unless you have a specific reason for something else, go to Adoptium and use that Java. IBM's J9 variant, which has been used in Domino for, I guess, as long as Java's been in there. I don't know about like 4.6 or whatever. But that one is open source, named Sumeru. They maintain it on their side. And so that is still used in Domino just as OpenJ9. And so that one, every once in a while, especially on the Mac, it starts to matter which version of Java you're using with Domino stuff. Normally, you don't have to care, but it's good to know that it's there. And OpenJ9 is nice. It has a lot of charms. And then there are plenty of others. So Amazon has one, Microsoft has one that isn't J# this time. And so they have more, and a lot of the times they're kind of like, this is our version for our cloud platform. But in edge cases, like for example, when macOS moved to ARM, I think it was the Zulu distribution was the first one out of the gate that had proper ARM support. So I used that one for a bit. Now they all do, but there are ones at different times. There are different reasons to use them. In general, though, Adoptium is your friend. Now, onto the features. I reorganized things a bit since I actually gave this presentation at Collapsphere, but I realized that I should start with the best one. So I'll use my most powerful feature out of the gate, which is that null pointer exceptions are better now. So usually, in the past, you would just see null pointer exception. If you had a line that had like 4 method calls on it, you'd have no idea what's going on. Now they tell you what was null. You don't have to do anything. This just happens. So if you have the same code running on Domino 11 or 12, and then the same code running on Domino 14, and you hit a null pointer exception, you'll have a better message now. Sometimes there may be, you still don't know why it's null, because that's your fault, but it will at least tell you what is null. So this is a tremendously useful feature, especially because things like, for example, Java 8 really, really encourages chaining methods, which is nice, except for the fact that if you have a null pointer exception, you're out of luck. So now it will just tell you exactly what the method is that you can't call because the thing is null. You'll still need to track down why it's null. You'll still need to do the legwork of figuring out what's going on. But at least this will actually tell you. And again, you don't have to change anything. Same code is better now. So that one's a great one. Now, next up are a bunch of nice little methods on strings, which is actually kind of a change of pace for Java. So for a long time, Java was not big on niceties and syntax sugar, but they kind of changed their pace recently. So there's long been, and this is just kind of a list of some neat stuff. So for example, there are better versions of trim. So, if you're using anything other than like ASCII space, now you have better methods. There's strict indent, which is, I'm shocked that this is in the JVM. Like, this will look for leading indentation in things like code blocks and remove that. Like, that is doing more legwork than I'm used to Java doing for you. And it's kind of neat that it's in here. I think it's probably in here because the next feature I get to kind of encourages you to indent your strings. And so they put this in here to make it so that your code could look nice. And then you could also create indentation and niceties like repeating a string. So if you want to say foo twice, you don't have to type foo twice. Instead, you could type foo repeat 2, which is technically longer, but it's a new feature. Now you have is blank, which is very handy because, for example, sometimes you have is empty in, I say current, meaning Java 8, which is 10 years old. Currently, you have is empty, which only just says is your string 0 characters, but is blank will also look for only white space. Unfortunately, you still kind of need to have a utility class like the IBM Commons one, string util, or strings from Guava or something, because if your string is null, which is often interchangeable with an empty string, you can't call is blank on it. Although I guess if you do, you'll have a better message now. There's a new method .lines, which splits the string on new lines and then gives you a stream of that. So I think there's a method on the files class that will do this for a file, which it's very useful if you're like parsing an INI or something like that, where everything's on one line, or generally. And so you have this now on if you happen to have a string that contains this sort of one line per whatever. Now you just have a nice thing. And then finally, you have transform. This is one of those ones that is just a nicety for syntax. Like this doesn't give you any powers that you didn't have before. Like you apply a function to make another object, so there's nothing stopping you from doing if some condition and then return a different string. But now you could build it in if you're like chaining an optional and then mapping it to something, and then it just kind of fits better with the code. And so this is actually a good exemplar of that new style of Java where they make things that just are kind of nice in certain situations, even if you don't have to use them all the time. And speaking of very nice, text blocks are in. So for the longest time, Java strings were one line only. You could do /n, but if you wanted to have a multi-line block of code, you would have to either just do it all on one line with /n, or you would have to do string concatenation, which is bad for looking at. I guess the compiler could probably optimize it, but like it gets weird. Like it obscures the meaning, it obscures what you're doing, it obscures the text itself because you're littering it with all of these escape characters. But now if you have code or like a big block of text, like if you have a long like here's my explanation for what you're doing wrong in your exception or something, now you can do it nicely like this. And you can see here, this is where visually in code, it's nice to indent your multi-line block because you don't necessarily want to shunt it all the way to the left. But now string has a strip indent. So this is probably exactly why that method was added, because now you could write this in your code so it's very, very readable for the programmer, but then do strip indent so you don't necessarily have 5 tabs at the start of every one of your lines of text. So the story with strings, lots of niceties. There are actually more in later versions. I think there's a lot of things that were added. Some are still in preview. There's even a preview that for variable interpolation. So if you've used stuff like Perl or basically any scripting language, JavaScript has it with those backtick strings. You can put variables in strings now. It's still technically a preview even in Java 21, but that's coming down the line. Like they're adding a lot of niceties, especially around strings, which have always been better than C strings, but not by much, basically. So next big one is HttpClient. So Java has long had HTTP URL connection and friends. So you have URL connection and you have HTTPS URL connection and all that. They technically do the job. I think a lot of us have written code that uses ls2j to use these to call REST services or otherwise download files. They work, but they're not great. The mechanics are awkward. When you want to do like authentication, you have or like dealing with different TLS certificates and things. There's like weird global state and indirection, and it's just very odd. And even whenever I was using these, every single time I would have to look something up. Like, how do I do X with URL connection, even though I would do the same thing 10 times. There are tons and tons of third-party libraries. Apache HttpClient is one of the biggest ones. But those generally require dependencies. Not necessarily the end of the world, but Domino always makes dependencies difficult, and so the fewer dependencies needed, the better. HttpClient is added in Java 9, so it's definitely there by 17, and it's much, much, much better than URL connection, which is also still there. Here you get a builder to provide your configuration options. It supports HTTP2 and WebSocket as a client. It can run async. I don't know if you necessarily want to run it async on Domino because different threads are always weird. Again, on Domino, it's one of those things that it makes weird. But you don't necessarily need to, because usually what you want to do is just say, give me either a string or some JSON or whatever back from an endpoint, and that's all you care about doing. And now you can do this in a much, much nicer way. So, for example, instead of doing a weird indirection thing, you can just say authenticator, and it will come with standard stuff like basic authenticator, and it's a pluggable system, so whatever kind of thing you have going on, you can add in how you're going to authenticate. Usually it's going to be basic for this sort of thing, or a token, like a bearer token that you got from somewhere. The SSL context is very, very useful. This is one of the other things that you run into a lot. For example, if you have a self-signed certificate, like you're connected to a dev server or it's an internal server, and you don't necessarily care about getting even a Let's Encrypt certificate, now you can set an SSL context that will trust that, either saying trust everything or trust this one specifically. Again, this means you don't have to do this whole pile of code that you may have seen where you have to say, get me the default SSL context, blah, 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 blah. Now you can just say, pass it in with this. It's part of this client. It's part of this system. It's right there as it should be. And different rules about how you're going to follow redirects, or what the connection timeout is, or the HTTP version. And so a lot of these things, like, other than HTTP2, like a lot of these things, I forget if URL connection supports HTTP2, but a lot of these things are doable in the old way, but they were awful. And so now you have this new mechanism for building your client and establishing these rules. And it gets even better when you're actually doing the request and getting the content. So you make the request with a similar builder. You say, I want to connect to this URI. I want to do a GET request. I want to add these headers. So if you could add your authorization either here or via the authenticator, and then build that and then send it. And then you have this concept of a body handler. And so you may say just of string, or you can say of a byte array, or if you have a custom one, you'd say, give me a JSON object or something like that. And so previously, you would have had to say open connection and then read the stream and then read that into a byte array or read it as a string or whatever. And again, it used to be doable, but it used to be awful. And so now you can just do it, and it's nicely extensible and it's standard. And as long as you're using Java 9 or above, then you can do this. So this is a huge, huge addition, and this is just always there. So it's there for agents, it's there for X pages, it's there for anything you're doing with Java on Domino 14 and above. And so I'd say if you're doing any sort of HTTP client stuff that you're using with URL connection, or even if you're using an existing library, consider moving to this, because it's always nice to reduce your dependencies, even if the dependencies are fine. It's just good to not have to use them. Next up are records. So this is an interesting addition that, depending on kind of where and how you use Java, may be game-changing or it may be unimportant. For us, I think it's somewhere in between. So records are a new type alongside classes, interfaces, annotations, and enums. So much like you might say public class foo, you can now say public record foo. They're meant to represent immutable data in a compact way. So they're somewhat conceptually similar as structs in C, not identical. I mean, C structs have there's a lot of implication about how they're laid out in memory, like it's just how they are in the structure, what you're doing in there. This is similar in the broad strokes of I want to have a couple pieces of related named data that I just put in a thing and shuttle it around my application. These are similar to if you've used Project Lombok, which has a lot of niceties like auto-generating getters and things like that. These are similar to some of the things that Lombok has, but these are faster because they're in the JDK. And so if you're in there, you get a lot of optimizations. These may be of limited use in Domino for a while. They're not a bean type, so if you've used, like for example, I don't think you could use these as like an application scoped bean. Because the constructors are different and you don't set values on them, and so a lot of our frameworks don't know what to do with them. Jakarta EE framework should, if they don't already, they should in the next version whenever I get around to getting 3 out there. So this is mostly useful for inside your code, like just Java to Java sort of thing. And this is what they look like. So it's a very, very simplified way to declare an object. So you just say public record employee, and you say string name, string department, string ID. So it has some implicit methods. So you can ignore all of the comments here because those are, they're just comments. So this is all of the code you need to declare a class that has those properties. It has methods to get the name, department, and ID. And it also has nice equals hash code and 2 strings. So these are all things where if you wanted to make a nice data holding class, so something like I want to represent an employee, or I want to represent a ticket or whatever, just any kind of noun. A lot of the times, all you care about really is storing them in an object and then getting those values out of that object once you get it somewhere else. So you read it from a database, you read it from a network connection, and you send it somewhere else. This is what records are meant for, and this is what they are exceptional at. So they have, it has all this. Again, these are immutable. The records themselves are immutable. So there's no set name, there's no set department. If you store an object in here that is itself not immutable, then you could change that. But like the stuff in here, so for example, strings in Java are immutable. You can't change them after you've created them. You can only make a new object. And so this record right here, once you make it, will never change, which is actually very, very useful. It's great for threading. It's great for just conceptualizing the object. It's great for avoiding certain bugs. If you want to make a new employee, like if they change departments, you would take this employee and make a new one and change it, but with a different department. And I think that there's a JEP, it's an enhancement proposal for built-in, like, make me a new object based on this one with one change. I'm not 100% sure, but I think I saw that. Certainly it's not in current Java anyway. But it's just a nicety to have there where you'd say, I just want to encapsulate this data in a nice way and shuttle it around my code, much like you might do with a struct, but again, technically very different. But this is just a nice thing. So it's the sort of thing to keep in mind when it comes up. It can be very, very useful. Now, along with strings, I mentioned how there are a lot of niceties, which is a big difference from past Java. They've been adding a lot of syntax sugar. So if you're not familiar with the term, this is just things that make something that was already doable cleaner and simpler in the code that you're writing. So potentially the compiler may change your code when it's compiling it to be the old style, but you get to write it the new style. That happens a lot. That's basically how autoboxing works, if you're familiar with that, basically. But they've been adding a lot of stuff, and there's stuff after 17 as well. And this seems to be one of the other themes of, hey, what if we make it enjoyable to write Java instead of miserable? So this is that category. So for example, instance of can do an implicit cast. So if you have code that's handed just some object, so this actually comes up a lot in things like with UI code like X pages, where the UI may be handing you a string, or it may be handing you an integer or something else like that, and various other cases. You'll say, okay, if my incoming thing is a string, then say now turn it into a string. Well, cast it to a string, and then I can do string stuff with it. If it's a number, cast it to a number, and now I can do number stuff with it. And the addition of instance of casting is now you can just do that on one line. So now you can say if it's an instance of string, implicitly cast it to some string and then work with some string. If it's a number, implicitly cast it to some number. So again, same result, like the left and right are equivalent, but you save 2 lines, and also you express more intent, which is one of the niceties of syntax sugar like this too. Like there's less room for mistakes. So for example, if I was going to extend the one on the left, I might copy the else if object instance of number and then paste it and then say, oh, if it's instance of my special class, then do this. But then I might accidentally forget to change the cast to match it or whatever. Like, I mean, the code might complain, but like that's the sort of thing that might happen. You're like creating more work for yourself. You're creating new bugs. Whereas in the second one, if I copy that, then I just change the single instance of the word number to the class I want. So the less you have to write number, the better, just for your hands, but also for the compiler and for your brain and for the developers following you. Like the intent of the second one is the same as the first one, but now it's written in code as opposed to kind of implicitly there in what the code is doing. The more of that, the better. Like the more you can say what you mean in your code rather than having to do it, the better. Additionally, switch expressions. So switch can now act as an expression. If you haven't used these, they're like case statements in Lotus script. And so you'd say like switch on some number and you'd say case 0, do this, case 1, do this. Java has been improving this, and actually after Java 17 even more. Now you can do it as a more structured version of the ternary operator, which is not important for this right now, except this is a potential replacement in some cases, where you'd say switch on some object, and now you can say when it's foo, then give you this value. When it's bar, you can do this one. And so this lets you do a very a more compact and again more explicit version of what you might be doing otherwise. So I know I've written code where I'd have something where it's like string result equals null, and then I would either switch on something or I'd have if statements that would end up setting result, and I'd have to make sure to set result to the right thing, and I'd have to make sure that it's always, whatever. I'd have to make sure to do things, whereas this is saying whatever the result of this switch is, assign it to the variable. So you can write all your code here, you can do all kinds of stuff, and then you know that all of these are implicitly returning a value and setting it in result. So you don't have to worry about saying result equals anything after this point. Again, you could do this before. It's not like there was no way to do this. You can put it in a method, you can put it in if blocks, you can do it in a lesser switch statement. But this is nice syntax sugar, and it's one that they're building on more. There is a new keyword for this, yield, because things would get a little funky if you put return there, because this is not actually a method. And so they use yield, which if you've used scripting languages, I know it's in Ruby, it's in others as well. This is kind of like a common term for this sort of thing where it means different things in different languages. But here you're saying I want to return, but it's not a method, so don't return yield with this value. So that's the way you say in a block of code how to return it. And next up is type inference in var. So there's a new var keyword that can be used to infer the type without actually writing it when you're doing assignment. So in Java, you could always do object foo equals any value, but then all Java knows and all the compiler knows is that it's an object of any kind. And so you couldn't, if you say object foo equals some string, you couldn't then call string methods. Now, if you type var some string equals hello, then some string will be actually of the type Java lang string. If you type var some number equals 3, it'll be, I assume, Java lang integer, and so forth. And so some method may return your own custom, like if it returns an employee record, then method result will be the name of the employee, or not the name of the employee, it will be a type employee in actual code, so that you can then call methods on it. When this first happened, I was so excited about this because I'm like, finally, I'm tired of writing, string foo equals string, whatever. Like, Java has you write the same noun many, many, many times, and I was so happy to have this in here. I have become less enamored with this over time. I mean, it's still very good, and it's still very useful, especially in basic cases. But my problem with it comes in with the collections framework, so list and set and all that. I really, really like defining my variables to be the most generic version of what they can be, even if I know they're going to be something else. So whenever I've blogged about the collections framework, I've said stuff like, don't make your variable type array list, make it just list, but then say equals new array list. Because of the fact that array list is implemented as an array internally is not important to your code, and so it should not be in there. I like setting it explicitly here because there are certain times when it would otherwise be set to a more concrete version of it, and you don't actually want that. So, for example, if you set it to a vector, which is common if you're using Notes.jar, then vector has a bunch of methods on it that are not on the list interface. So, like I think it has like first element and stuff like that. That if you then change it to be a different type of list, then you might have code using these vector specific methods, and things get messy. This is mostly personal preference on my part. I'm getting more persnickety as I get older on this kind of thing. I used to be more of a scripting language guy than I am now, and so that's why I was excited originally. That said, all of these are code cleanliness and personal preference. Var is in there. It works exactly as it's designed to work, and especially if you have something like var some number equals 3, go for it. One thing that's important to note is that var is a stand-in for the type at initial assignment. So you can't say var sumString equals hello and then sumString equals 3, because sumString is a string. It's not a scripting language style, any old value that you can assign here. So it's only syntax sugar. So var is identical to if, in this case, you wrote string sumString equals hello, or integer some number equals 3. So you can't. It's not a general scripting languagey sort of thing, which is good. It keeps with how Java is supposed to work. So you have to keep that in mind. I don't mean to say don't use this. I am not as crazy about it, but obviously it has its uses, and I'll probably come around on certain cases. So I am actually like running through this really at a great clip, I suppose. So on to some grab bag stuff. So in addition to those kind of tentpole features that we use, I have a little grab bag of just general functionality that they've added. So private interface methods. This is, and the reason I kind of put these on their own just one slide is that they're probably not going to be as useful. Private interface methods are now so if you are familiar with default methods in interfaces added in Java 8, that means that you can put some actual implementation functionality on an interface, which previously was not allowed. Like you could only put method signatures on there and constants, I guess. But now, now as of 2014, you can put default methods. This was added primarily because Java 8 added a whole lot of convenience methods like stream and the like, and to existing interfaces, and they didn't want to force themselves or everybody else to have to make the same implementation of those. But they're also useful for making it so that interfaces can be kind of like a pseudo abstract class. They can't have instance variables, but you can have some functionality. You can go a little too far with this. I have, but it's good to know. And private interface methods are useful because your kind of pseudo implementation might want to have its own method that isn't part of the interface, but you don't want to have to write the same code 5 times if you have 5 similar methods. And now you can have a method on the interface that's private to itself. This, to me, it's got some code smell to it. Like there are cases where you might want to do this. And this is probably another one that is driven by internal implementation needs. I would be wary of doing this too much. Certainly it can be useful, especially if, like the Java framework developers, you are writing interfaces for existing code that's going to be grafted on top of it. But if you're writing new code and you're writing new interfaces that are not going to be consumed as a framework by others, I'd say you're probably just going to want to use abstract classes or normal methods. But it's there if you need it. There are cases where it'll still be useful, but I'd say this is one of those things where you should be aware when you're using it that it's not necessarily going to be something you're happy that you did years from now. Next up is the diamond operator on anonymous classes. This is fiddly enough that I didn't even bother with an example. So the diamond operator is if, for example, this was added in 7, I think, you can do list angle, like left angle, right angle, foo equals new array list string. And so that way you just don't have to write that it contains a string twice. This was not available if, for example, you were doing like new comparator as an anonymous class in your code. Now it is. It's fairly likely that you have not done this, especially because lambdas came along at the same, in Java 8 and eliminated a lot of the need to write out new blah, 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 except in certain cases. But anyway, now it can infer that. So if you ran into that, which I did a couple times, now you don't have to do it. So that's nice. There's a new method on optional called .orElseThrow. As far as I know, it does the same thing as .get. So if you have an optional that is empty and you do .get, then it will throw a, I believe, null pointer exception rather than returning null. And so now they're like, well, that is in the documentation, but now the code just says or else throw, which means without having to give it an exception type. And that just kind of makes your code a little more explicit. So there was already an or else throw where you could give it a customized exception, which is generally what you'd want to do. For example, in a lot of REST service code I write, I'll say, find this record by the ID that was passed in, or else throw a not found exception. But if you don't pass any parameters, it'll still throw a null pointer exception, but this makes your code more consistent. It makes the meaning of what you're doing better. So while it's weird that they just added a method that does the same thing as an existing method, it does make sense in that it now makes optional kind of more consistent. And again, even if the functionality is the same, expressing your meaning better to consumers of your code, to yourself, to other developers is always better. Another one, and I mentioned this on my blog post when Domino 14 came out, is that you can't use sun.misc.base64 encoder anymore. This one has a bit of history, which is that up through version Java 7, there wasn't really official good base64 handling in Java. It did exist, and it existed in 2 ways. One was that there was an internal class on IBMs. It was com.ibm.misc.base64 encoder. On Suns, it was this sun.misc. But you're not supposed to use internal implementation ones. We already hit this a little bit in the move to Java 11 because Domino 10 and below had the com.ibm one. Java 11 switched to Sun. So if you switched your code to Sun, you'll have to switch it again. Since Java 8, there's an actual Java util base64, and so just use that. That's the correct one to use all the time. So just use it. If you're using a third-party library that has its own digest utils or encoders or whatever, it's fine to use that too, but just use the built-in one. That's why it's there. Another good one to know for administrators primarily, or developers telling administrators what to do. Java policy was moved from JVM libsecurity to JVM comp security. It's the same file, same meaning, it just moved to a different place. I'd say if you're on Linux or Docker, use the notes users home directory .java.policy, because that's consistent on older versions as well, so that's always been there. On Windows with Domino 14, you tend to run not as local system anymore, so you could put it in wherever the heck the user's home directory you're running as is. Whenever, I use Docker as my primary way to run Domino nowadays, and so in my Docker files, I tend to have a line that adds a Java policy file directly to the notes home directory, so it's kind of enforced and it's always there. I find that to be the best way to go. Especially if you're on Windows and you don't want to track down wherever the home directory is, JVM comp security, same meaning, same rules, but it's just in a different place now. Now I have a couple kind of good to know changes, things that either you will have to change things about or you'll have to be aware of the changes if you're going to do certain things or potentially down the line change other code. So JVM libEXT is gone, and so this affects Domino as well. It was common practice for Domino developers, and much to my chagrin, HCL, to stash jars to be present in the whole Java class path. So this is admittedly useful for agents to avoid memory problems, since Agent Manager has, for a long time, and I forget if it's fixed or not, had a problem where if you have jars attached to your agent, Agent Manager will eventually run out of memory. Because it doesn't clean it up properly. It's also useful for X pages to avoid permissions problems, which I'll get to shortly. And so it's still potentially useful to put jars on the file system. I don't like it, but sometimes you kind of have to do it. And at the very least, a lot of the times people have done it. So if you're moving to Domino 14, Domino has long had an NDX directory in the program folder that was on the runtime class path. So that was actually always there. So I've seen this crop up a couple times. Like, for example, the OSGI update site template uses SWT, even though SWT is not generally available for agents. That's because it happens to be available in NDX, I guess, for some reason. And so it uses that because whoever wrote it was probably very, very comfortable with Eclipse, and Eclipse uses SWT, so there it is. And so it's always been, or at least as long as I've known, it's always been on the runtime class path. So for servers, I recommend, if you're running 12 or below now, but you plan to move to 14, I recommend moving any of your custom jars to NDX anyway, because it's the same effect for servers. And that will just get you used to it. That's one less thing you'll have to change when you move to 14. For the Notes client, it's a little different because, you don't necessarily care what's on the class path when an agent is running if you're trying to work in Designer. For agents, it's also on the build class path now in Designer, which is different in 14 than it was previously. So it was not on the build class path. So Eclipse Designer wouldn't be able to find it. It's not there for X pages in 14. I haven't checked FP1. I don't know if it's on there, but it's not there for X pages in 14. You have to add your libraries manually. I have a screenshot of how to do this in the blog post where I first mentioned this. That's included at the end of these slides, which will also be available on OpenNTF site when all is said and done. Next up, Security Manager is deprecated. So this is a mechanism that dates from the early days of applets, because you would want to control what applets are doing on your desktop when you're running them in Netscape Navigator. For some reason, this is still here, and it's still used, and Domino still does it, at least for X pages, very poorly. And it still hinders X pages development in the same way. It's still there in Java 17. It's still there in Domino 14, unchanged. And in fact, it will yell at you. If you've been using Domino 14, you've probably seen this. When you start HTTP, you'll get a message that looks very threatening, because it is, but it's actually fine. Because since you're not going to change the Java version in Domino, it's not your problem that Notesjar is using something that's going to be gone eventually. I'm not sure how this will change in the future, but if you see this message, that's fine. And if you're writing code that targets Java 17, like in Eclipse or something like that for a plugin where you're using access controller.doPrivileged, you will get deprecation warnings. This is just the nature of things, I guess. My hope is that there is no agent security manager that enforces anything anymore. I don't know if there should be like a stub around it or something, but I just want this framework gone. I'm glad it's going away, and I will be happy as a clam when it's finally dead and buried. But for now, we're in a weird little in-between area where all of the classes still exist. They're all deprecated. The server will yell at you, but it's all fine. So you don't actually have to change anything now, and I don't know what you will have to change in the future. But this is what it is. It's good to know, and we can all look forward to the bright, sunny day when we never have to care about this again. And finally is the Java EE component move. So up through Java 8 and to a lesser extent up through Java 10, there were various components that were properly part of Java EE that were in the core JVM and are no longer there. So this is done for various reasons, all generally good. Part of it is that if you like Oracle donate Java EE to Eclipse, you can't very well have Eclipse manage the core JVM anymore. So you had to get that stuff out of there. It was also always weird in that you might potentially have a newer version of these implementations outside of the JVM that compete with the implementation inside. So it's all better, but it does show up a little bit for us. So the main removals, as far as I know, are JAX-B. So this is converting between objects and XML, which is handy. And it's unfortunately, as much as I love XML, it's a little old-timey at this point. There's also JAX-WS, so that's SOAP Web Services, which are also, I don't love these, and they are old-timey. These are also still there in Designer. There's activation, don't worry about what that is. Common annotations, don't worry about what that is. And Corbo, which is basically there just to support SOAP Web Services. The only time you really need to care about these is if you're doing external development using Notesjar. So HCL did the right thing, and they put the basic implementations of these in, in this case, I actually think it was good that they put them in the global class path, because this is the least damaging and least disruptive way to do it. And honestly, they're kind of fine to have there. So, maybe that will change in the future, but the way they did it in 14 was perfect. I like it. So you don't have to change any of your Domino code on Domino in Designer. But if you are doing something like using notes.jar in a Maven project or an Eclipse Java project or something, you'll probably need to grab implementations and APIs for these specs yourself. So they're there in the NDX folder in Domino 14, so you could just point to them there. You could also look at the names of those and then find their Maven coordinates. So there's like the OMG API, and there's the Java Jakarta XML bind API and the implementation. I put a link here to the JEP, the enhancement proposal that talks about the specific reasons and what they did. So you could check that out if you are so inclined and are the type of person who would read JEPs, which it's actually good to do so. They're not too bad. And then some new features that are there, that have been added, that are not really, these are even less useful than the grab bag features from earlier, but I do want to mention them for completion's sake. There's a module system starting with Java 9. It's the JP Java Platform Module System, I think. It's actually a huge deal. It involved restructuring the internals of the JVM into modules, because before the JVM was basically just like a big bag of classes, and it still appears like that, but they're all broken up into modules now, and so that lets you, it's useful for if you're packaging like microservices and things like that, where you can really boil down and only care about the parts you care about, which is good for the compiler, it's good for distribution. It is completely irrelevant for Domino. It's also generally irrelevant for most like web app servers, like Java EE kind of web app servers. It's nice, and it does allow you to find parts that you need, but we don't need to care. App servers generally paper over the requirements because it's not important. The app server itself cares, but your app just, it has its dependencies. The app server provides what it does. And in this case, Domino is exactly like other app servers in this way, where it just provides you what it provides. You don't have to care why. So modules in this case are sort of an implementation detail. Some concepts are like OSGI, but they're not the same. So OSGI has a mechanism for saying, give me this bundle or give me this package and export this service and things like that. And modules have that. It's not the same though, because OSGI has a lot of versioning stuff on top of it, which is really nice, and it has different service mechanisms and all sorts of other things that are not present in modules. And I think modules has some stuff that's not in OSGI. Modules have the advantage of being in the JVM, but I mean, Domino always has a full JVM. The slim build aspect doesn't mean anything. We don't need to say include java.whatever as a module. We just don't need to care. But if you are writing standalone Java applications like with Maven and stuff, you may want to look into this and you may want to use it. Like it provides, I haven't really done that much with it because I do OSGI all the time, but it provides some good discipline. It provides some nice features and, again, explicitness, and they're good. But we're in a weird spot where we just don't have a reason to care. So they're there. It's kind of like an implementation detail. It's like if they rewrote some implementation from C to C++ or whatever. It's nice, but who cares? Sealed classes are next up. So this is I hate this, but I get why it's here. It allows you to specify which other classes may extend a base class. So, previously you could say, oh, this class is final, which means nothing can extend it. But if you wanted to have an abstract class, then you would have that class be extendable by anything. And God forbid, I guess, a developer might want to extend a framework class. We can't have that. So now you can explicitly enumerate the names of classes that will be able to implement it. So this is really best for internal implementations and frameworks. Really internal, like it can be useful if you have a large team and you want to signal intent. Like, so say you have various service classes and you have some implementations. This can be a good way to tell, like if you have a new person on the team working with your code, this will effectively tell them you're not supposed to be implementing this yourself without you having to go over to their desk and tell them. But for apps, though, I think it would be more annoying than it's worth, because this is definitely the sort of thing where you can kind of get yourself in trouble by being too clever, where you can say, oh, I know exactly, I have an interface fruit, and I know only apples and oranges exist. Those are the only fruits, and so I'm going to permit only those to extend this, or I guess class fruit. But then you realize, wait a minute, there are more fruits than that. Now I need to go back and change my framework code, and now I need to blah, blah, blah. Not worth it. So I'd say just know that it's here. If you come up with a really good use case for it, use it. But in general, I would advise against it. So this is another one where it's in here, and you should know about it, but I don't like it. So that actually covers all the stuff from Java 17, but I am going to dip in a little into Java 21. So Java 21 is not in Domino 14, so you don't necessarily need to know this right away, but I do have more time left on the webinar, so I'm going to tell you. And it's still good to know for the future and see where the language is going. And also, if you write code that uses a separate JVM, like if you have a JVM launched alongside Domino, or if you're just writing Java code that doesn't run on Domino at all, like if you're using the Domino REST API or not Domino at all, you can use Java 21 and, in fact, Java 22 right now, and it works great. So this is stuff that's good to know, and if it ever shows up in Domino, great. If it doesn't, it's still good to see where things are going. So a big one is, again, along the lines of being nice to programmers. So there's a new type called sequenced collection. So this is extending my beloved collections framework, which I will never shut up about because I love it. And this makes it even better. So there's a new general interface called sequence collection, and what that's saying is that it's a collection that has some sequence. It doesn't matter what it is. It might be because it's sorted. It might be auto sorting. It might be because that's the order in which they were added. It might be by birthday. I don't know. So a set might have an order, a list definitely has an order, its insertion order, might be a queue, which is similarly insertion and removal order, but basically this adds get first and get last and related methods. So I mentioned earlier that vector has like get first element or something, and admittedly, that's actually a nice method to have, and it's kind of a shame that list did not have get first and get last, and now it does. It also has a dot reversed, which is handy. You could reverse a collection earlier, but now you can just do it in code. And again, much more explicit than writing a thing that actually reverses it. So if you have a list that's in one order and you want to display in the other, like your data comes in date ascending order, then you might say, well, I want to show latest first. So you just do dot reverse, and there you go. And so these are just some niceties. Like, again, you could always do dot get 0 and dot get list.length -1, but those are both cumbersome and also potentially fragile, because if you do .get 0 on an empty list, you get an exception. And I forget if you do for .get first, but at the very least, you know better what's going on and you know what the intent is. So rather than array index out of bounds, blah, 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 you'll at least see I was calling get first and that didn't work. Or it might return null, I'm not sure. There's another more specific one, sequence set. So this is generally useful for, it's a good way to be a little more generic than sorted set. So I said earlier when talking about the var keyword that I really, really like to make my variables as generic as possible while still expressing the intent of what I'm doing. So sorted set already existed, and that was tree set. So that would say, oh, this is sorted. But you might have a set that is in a specific order. It has a meaning, but it is also a set. So you can think of notes document collection as this sort of thing. So obviously, notes.jar does not implement anything newer than 1990, but if it did, document collection could implement this because a document collection does have an internal order. It might be sorted because you got it from a view, it might not be, but it does have an internal order, but it is also a set because an ID can only exist in there once. So it's useful to, you can think of it that way as an example. And then next up is sequence map. So like sequence collection, but for maps. So linked hash map, if you've ever used this, is a handy way to say, I want to have a map of key to value, but I want, when I iterate over it, for that iteration to be in the same order that the things were added. So a great use of this is a JSON object, where JSON objects, conceptually, the order that the keys appear are not important, but they can be, and why not? It's extra data that you know because you see the JSON object written in a text file in a certain order, and so that order exists. You may as well retain it. So I like to use linked hash map for that, and now you can say sequence map is an example of that. So there are other cases, but JSON object is the best one that comes to mind. Virtual threads. Virtual threads is a big one, kind of. So this is a new type of thread that tries to reuse OS threads as much as possible to improve scalability. So in computer sciencey terms, an operating system thread is expensive comparatively. I mean, different OSs have different meanings for expensive for that, but if you spawn a new thread for every single thing you do, you will eventually exhaust resources. I saw an example of virtual thread saying, okay, well, if you have something that spawns a new thread for 10 tasks, it's basically the same. If it's 100, it starts getting a little expensive. If it's 1,000,000, your computer may or may not be able to handle it. What virtual threads do is say, okay, I want to act like this is a thread, but your code doesn't actually know what OS thread it's running on. And what this means is if you have code that does a small thing, but you want to do a lot of them at once, you can use virtual threads and scale up way, way, way higher, like 10 million threads, because they're not actually using 10 million threads. They're just sharing a pool of operating system threads. If you've used executor services in Java, this is actually kind of similar, but there are technical and both for the user and for the implementation differences with these. You can generally use them like normal threads. There are things that either are meaningless or illegal with a virtual thread that you can do with a normal thread. But the main purpose of these is to have very, very scalable code that acts like it's going with threads, but is not necessarily. If you end up trying to use them with Domino somehow, good luck. Domino cares a lot about native threads, and virtual threads are a weird match, much like some of the other stuff. I don't know how this is going to shake out, like the access controller stuff. If it ever shows up on Domino, we'll see. Good luck with that. If you do this and you figure something out, put it in the Discord. I'd love to hear about it. Next up is more syntax sugar. So I mentioned the records and improved instance of in Java 17, and now you can do what decomposing or destructuring. I guess decomposing makes it sound worse. Destructuring, where you can say, okay, if what I was given was a record, I can also say, if it's a point that has X and Y, I can then refer to X and Y here. So this feels a little unnatural for Java at first. This is very strange. But if you've been using newer JavaScript or other historical functional languages, they love this sort of thing. All pattern matching in general, they love it. They love matching patterns and extracting values. So you can extract this, and then that way you don't have to do O.X and O.Y or whatever. I mean, good, I guess. If you only care about certain parts of it, that's nice. So this is one of those ones that's good to know. Clearly, this is with the intent of cleaning up certain kinds of code. You have to be really bought into records to get a lot of use out of this, and since we currently aren't, it may be a little while, but if you start writing a lot of code with records and then move to Java 21, this will probably be very nice to you. And I mentioned pattern matching in general. Now they've also glommed that on to the switch statement. So I mentioned the kind of switch statement you could do before, and then now you can pattern match the instance of in your switch statement. So you could say if it's a string, do this. If it's a number, do this. So again, it's, you could do that certainly with if, but now it's just there in the switch statement. So depending on your kind of code, this can be very, very succinct while not being messy. You could make this very weird and messy. You could go nuts with this. So be careful. Then there's enum pattern matching. So this is kind of take those other ones and combine them with this too. So you could always switch, not always, at least as long as enums exist. So you could switch on enums and check their values. And now you can also combine that with checking the type of the object. So it's fine. Be careful. Like, again, this is very situational, I'd say. Like, if you have code that will be better like this, but it's also the sort of thing that you could very much get yourself in trouble doing. And you could get even weirder. Things get nuts. You can use a when statement to guard your checks. So you could say if it's a string and also that string is not empty, do this. If it's a string, and actually I wrote this in the wrong order because the second one will never happen. I should have put the hello one first. But if it's a string that starts with hello, you can do this. So these, I believe, can be arbitrarily complex. So again, be careful, but this can be useful. So if you're like looking for strings, because for example, you can switch on strings since 7, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to say, oh, a string that starts with whatever, which would be a very common thing. Like if you have a specific format for your like internal record IDs or something because of your purchasing system, if the first 2 characters indicate whatever, now you could switch on that. You could say, I guess you could do substring, but it's a nicety. There are various cases where you'd want to do this sort of thing that wouldn't make your code an unmaintainable pile of garbage. Be careful. It's there. Use it when it's appropriate if you're using Java 21. And yeah, it's nice, but be wary. And there's more. There's snippets in JavaDoc, which is kind of nice. So JavaDoc is decent for what it is, but it does lag behind documentation systems in other languages. I would love to be able to use Markdown and stuff, for example, but they're not adding tons, but they did add code snippets. So there's some neat stuff you can do where you can kind of like tag up your code, like actual code, and include it as a snippet, or you can do a better job writing snippets rather than just using pre-tags in HTML. This is neat because it gives your JavaDoc more meaning. I think you can do some highlighting stuff. At the very least, it just gives more semantic meaning and convenience for your JavaDoc. There's a simple web server in Java now. This is common in a lot of languages, especially scripting languages. Like I know this is actually handy in my hated Python has a basic class where you can just say serve up this directory that I'm in on a web server, which is neat. Java has one now too. I haven't really looked into it because I am not hurting for web servers, but this is one that's in here, and it could be useful for local development or just in general, just having the ability to spin up a web server without having to use a dependency. There's lots and lots of preview features. So I didn't mention the concept of preview features, but one of the things that they're doing in newer Java now is they have a mechanism where they can say, we're adding a feature, but it's not officially done yet because it might change. So you have to explicitly opt in. I usually stay away from these just because I don't want to have to change my code later, but they can be neat. There's some very, very interesting stuff, including further incubation of a native function call system. So if you've used JNA, which lets you call functions at the C level without having to write a JNI wrapper, this is basically JNA but better. You'll find if you look up documentation for this, they never mention JNA for some reason, even though this is clearly just JNA but better. I think it's even using the same FFI library. But this will be great. I'm looking forward to that in particular. And there's lots of other weird stuff in there, like more switch stuff and things like that. So Java is advancing very, very fast. So I would say even if there's stuff in here that you have no reason to use yet or can't use yet because it's in 21 or later, I'd say just give it a shot. Like fire up Eclipse and make a new project in this and try these things out. Because I think a lot of these things just in the abstract are not, you don't necessarily get a feel for why you would use them until you do start using them and be like, and then once you've had a little experience, you go back to your other stuff and you're like, man, I really wish I had those better switch statements right now. So I'd say tinker around with it. I have a list of resources here. So this is basically, other than the last one, this is where I stole all my content from. And then the last one is the one that I mentioned where this is specific to notes in Domino. Like, here's some things you need to know. So it mentions the designer class path things. So all of these blog posts are excellent to read. As always, Baildung is high on my list of go-to places. But all of these are good, just saying, here's the new stuff. If you haven't been watching every single JEP and every single release of Java, here's what you need to know. And so with that, I think I can finish it up and look to see if there are any questions.
Remind folks that they can use the questions panel to throw in your questions, and again, we'll read them out and answer them so that they're recorded on the video. Our good friend Sidar is up with the first couple of questions. We'll read it out in full here. What is compatibility in cross-version scenarios? For instance, can a code compiled with Java 17 run on Java 1.8 or vice versa? Of course, assuming we don't use incompatible functionality.
So yes, with an asterisk. So right. So you mentioned incompatible functionality. So I mentioned in that blog post that you have to be wary of your target for the compiled Java bytecode. In general, well, not in general, always currently, Java can compile down. I think there is a bottom limit, but currently the bottom limit is 8 is fine. You can compile down to an older version of bytecode. Java compilers unfortunately don't care about when a new feature was added. So as long as you tell your compiler, either Designer or Eclipse or Maven or whatever, to target Java 8, your code will still work. So as I mentioned in that blog post, there's a per database setting that you can do, and you probably want to check that if you're using Designer 14, because I think it changes based on when the NSF was created or whether you upgraded Designer or something. It's a little fiddly. But just be wary of that and make sure to target the right compiled version. And then don't use any newer APIs, because if you're compiling for Java 8, I think in general, unless things have improved, Designer would let you use the Java 8.9 HTTP client and then compile to Java 8 because the bytecode doesn't care. But then if you try to run it on Java 8, it won't work. So you can use newer Designer to target older notes in Domino. Just make sure you're compiling to the right thing and then avoiding using newer features. You also, unfortunately, have to look out for if you're using third-party libraries, and at some point those have been moving to Java 11 or 17 as a baseline. So you just kind of have to try it, unfortunately, unless they document it well. This is one area where I really, really wish Java in general and Maven specifically had a better versioning mechanism. But you can do it. You just have to be a little wary of your own compiler settings and any libraries that you're using.
Right. Okay. Next one, as the security manager is gone, this was a little bit later in the presentation, what restrictions are lifted as a result?
I guess first off, it's not technically gone, so there are no restrictions lifted. My hope, though, when it finally does go, and I don't know what the code compatibility story on this will be, my hope is that all the bad restrictions will be gone, because security manager restrictions are stupid, and they are bad. And you could always, don't tell anyone, but you could always just write to that file using Lotus script and then restart the server, and you're fine. Don't do that, though, obviously. But security manager is stupid. All the rules were, it wasn't stupid at the time because you were running it in a web browser. You're not running it on a web browser. You're running it on a server you control now. So it's still there, but it acts the same exact way as it did previously. Now it just yells at you. But my hope is that we won't have to deal with stuff like, oh, you're not allowed to use reflection because the security manager doesn't like it. Use reflection. It's a programming language. You're supposed to be able to use reflection. So yeah, I can't say what the future may hold for this. Right now, nothing is lifted. It's all the same. But my hope, and I haven't really done much with newer Java than 17, so I haven't really tested stuff in an environment where security manager is actually gone. I forget if it's gone in 21. Probably, I hope so. But yeah, we'll see.
Okay, and we've got one last question here. So reminder for anybody, if you do have a question, please pump it in now. But a good friend of the community, Mike McGarrell, has a question about the OpenNTF Domino API and compatibility on the Domino 14. So any known conflicts between Java 17 and the OpenNTF Domino API?
I don't know of any other than that it won't support any necessarily any newer features. Like so, if they're like ODA doesn't know about records, for example. So it's fine with classes generally, but like it won't necessarily do certain things that are newer. Kind of like how I don't think it knows about the Java.time API from 8. But as far as I know, it works. Like I have tested client apps on 14 without having to change ODA. So there you go. I guess like they use ODA a lot, and so that worked. If you find any, mention them, I guess, or if you have the gumption, fix them. But yeah, at the very least, mention them. I don't know of any explicit like you can't do this on Java 17 with ODA.
Awesome. And we did get another question here. Is Domino capable to understand a jar, multi-version jar file, which is compiled for both 8 and 17 and pick the correct version out of it?
I don't know, but my guess would be yes, because that's not really like that's kind of outside of what Domino would care about. It's worth a shot. I think that should work.
Yeah.
I personally have not tried it, and those are kind of neat. So I'd say give it a shot. Just because like I think that's probably up to the general class loader. I don't know how that would shake out if you're trying to like use something in OSGI because it doesn't really have that same kind of mechanism to my knowledge. But like if you had a jar on the file system, I think it should work normally. I would hope. Let me know.
Cool. Okay, that is everything. So thank you everyone for joining us. Again, this video will be posted to YouTube shortly or later today. And we look forward to, if you're going to be at Engage, we look forward to seeing you. And if not, we will see you right here next month at the next webinar, and before then on Discord. Thanks everybody, and have a great day.